I will introduce the panel when they've all arrived. If they've all arrived. Maybe he didn't like what we were saying. Maybe Jonathan got a little bit upset. No, I don't think so. I think it was all very genial downstairs. So, could I ask, just if you've got a mobile on, could you put it on mute, or if you can't bear to turn it off? That would be helpful. I'm amazed that so many people have come despite the tube strike and the icy conditions. This is hugely impressive. No, that's not a panelist. Wrong gender. We're looking for a panelist, but he has to be male.
Paddy, I'm not leaving you, but I'd just like to get a tissue from my coat pocket.
Oh, God. No, we're three.
It's you and me, Giles.
Sorry.
It's you
I
and
know,
me.
well, that's fine. On the spot.
There's plenty of seats up here.
So what's it being recorded for, Paddy?
It goes out on the front. It goes out on the Frontline website. Actually, I'll say this at the end, but Millicent, who's the person behind it all, will send an email to folks tomorrow with all the info.
So if it's that good, people can watch it all over again.
I think they'll want to, Giles. Great. Jonathan, great. That's all right. We can now start. We were worried you'd taken offence or something.
I was just warming my hands up.
Okay. Millie says we can go. So, aid and accountability. Icy evening, but this is going to be a very warm, possibly hot debate. Let me just introduce myself before I introduce the panel. I'm a gamekeeper turned poacher. I spent some of my life as head of media at Oxfam and 15 years of it making television programs with an organised on development for the International Broadcasting Trust. But in 2001, I went back to the academy to head up the Reuters journalism program at Oxford University. And in 2007, I transferred to Oxford's Department of International Development, not to be confused with DFID, if there are any different people. It's the Department of International Development at Oxford, which has a research centre called OPHI, the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, where I'm the communications director there. I also have a media consultancy. I feel I'm so delighted that Frontline is organising this, because as somebody who works in media, I'm utterly frustrated about the lack of a grown-up debate on aid. I think if there are journalists here, I think we can describe it as a Punch and Judy show. I think the absolute nadir of it, in my view, was in March this year when BBC World Service, I hope there may be some BBC World Service journalists here who I apologise, I'm not attacking the whole of the BBC World Service, but one particular programme where an allegation was made that 95% of a humongous amount of money, which was, I think, $100 million, or was it pounds? It doesn't matter with this sort of allegation, had gone astray. So that was the BBC, the mighty BBC, playing the aid goes down a very deep hole. And then we had the Judy, we had Bob Geldof saying, not a penny, not a single penny of Band-Aid, and he can swear to it, ever goes astray. I mean, this is just, let's get real. This is a joke. Behind it, editors are not really interested in aid, except when we have a run-up to Christmas, and then suddenly NGOs become flavour of the month, and you find a testimonial in your Guardian, or your Independent, or your Times, or your Telegraph about the wonders of NGOs. But most of the time, it's corruption and aid goes astray, if it's in there at all. So you have a situation where aid agencies are fearful. They really are. They don't want to go over the top on this and join a grown-up debate because they feel they will either get massacred or, in fact, if anybody's interested out there at all on the subject. So we've got a British public who is thoroughly confused. If you've looked at the survey, the information on public opinion in this country, we've got quite contradictory things. You can reassure yourself that nearly 3/4 of the Brits think that on the whole, aid is quite a good thing. But if you look at that very closely, you find that actually only 1/4 are very concerned about poverty in developing countries, and that 1/4 is actually creeping down towards 20%. And if you go and ask some other questions, you find that a majority of British people think that most financial aid is a waste of space. Someone described the grip of the British people on aid and development as a mile wide and an inch thick. I think this is a situation which, if you want to caricature it, is aid agencies saying bed nets and the grown-ups talking about budget support, but you're not allowed to break that to the British people. So I feel very strongly that it's time for us to have a proper debate, and I think Frontline is a safe place to have this debate. And I think it's a very good time because this very month the United Nations Development Programme published the Human Development Report 2010. Have people read it? Know of it? If you don't, you should really get hold of it because this was the 20th anniversary of the Human Development Reports, and they actually did 40-year scan. So we looked from 1970 up to 2010. And what's interesting about that is the United Nations Development Programme says that on the whole, significant progress was made, including in some of the very poorest countries. Now, of course, they also report on growing inequalities within and between countries. But, you know, that first bit, that significant progress has been made, some of which is the responsibility of aid funds. So here is something which we're talking about complexity. Let's see if our panel can handle the complexity. Now, we've got a very varied panel here, hopefully reflecting different perspectives. My terror is they will all agree somewhere in the soggy middle. If that's the case, I will try and encourage a little bit of confrontation. Otherwise, from a media point of view, it's totally boring. But Judith,
what you don't want.
Judith on the very far left of me is someone who I've known for quite a long time because she was at ActionAid. She had a senior position in ActionAid. But actually, in 1992, she and Tony German set up development initiatives. Now, if you don't know about development initiatives, you ought to. They have an extraordinary website called Aid Info, which I think your website's being overhauled at the moment, but it really has an awful lot of really relevant information, particularly the journalists in the room. You should look that one up. Judith is also involved with something which I hope she'll say something about, called IATI. Do you know IATI? Does the acronym mean anything? By the way, I'm going to get, if they say any acronyms, I'm going to get them to explain it. But IATI is an important one. It's the International Aid Transparency Initiative. I'm not going to talk about it because, but I hope that Judith will, because that's run by DFID, Her Majesty's government, the United Nations Development Programme in New York, and Development Initiatives, which is based in Sussex. Now, next to her is Vicki People. Vicki is here wearing the NGO hat, if you like, because she is an international development professional who is the program officer for a foundation called the STARS Foundation. And what it does is support local grassroots organizations in Africa. Their particular emphasis is with disadvantaged children. Giles, on my immediate left here, has also been very much involved in Africa, including heading up DFID's program in Rwanda, And then he had other posts with DFID, including deputy head of their international trade department. But he's here really because he's written a book about this called Aid and Other Dirty Business. That gives you a clue that he's up to no good. Its subtitle is An Insider Uncovers How Globalization and Good Intentions, that's most of us in this room, have failed the world's poor. So hopefully Giles can be relied on for some contentious views. In the middle is Jonathan Glennie. Jonathan is now at the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, which I think can be described as our country's leading think tank on aid and development. And Jonathan is a research fellow there at the Centre for Aid and Public Expenditure, so he certainly knows about our subject. In a former incarnation, he was with an NGO. He was the head of Christian Aid's program in Colombia. And he also worked on the Jubilee debt campaigns and the Make Poverty History campaigns. And he too has written a book, and his title is The Trouble with Aid: Why Less Could Mean More for Africa. So that's your panel. So the form of this evening is as follows. It's a game of two halves. Roughly, we have the first half, and you get the second half, okay? So what we're going to do is run through the panel, get them to set out their stall on the questions which are behind this particular session. So if you object violently to something that Giles or Judith says, and I hope you will, can you hold that, make a note of it, because you will get a chance. I'll try and get as many questions in and get the panel to respond to them as possible. But what I prefer to do is, rather than have Giles and then stop and get questions, we'll never get to Judith that way if we do that. So we really get, and also to get the diversity of views. So let's give the panel their chance, and then we'll turn over to the audience. Okay? Just to remind you of the, and remind our panel, in case they've forgotten, that there are really essentially three questions that we're addressing today. The first one is, do we need to have greater levels of accountability with aid? So that's really a view. What do you think of the current systems? Are they fit for purpose, or are they not? Second one is, what about corruption? Are there serious levels of aid corruption? And if there are, how should they be addressed? And then finally, and this is one that, if there's anybody representing Her Majesty's government, this is one that preoccupies them. Do we get the most bangs for our bucks? Is aid targeted in the best way? And if it isn't, how could it be made more effective? Three big questions. I'm going to start with Judith and just rip through the panel. So Judith, you've got 5 or so minutes to have your say on this. So what do you think? Do you think there's need for more accountability?
I wrote down my answer to your 3 questions, Paddy. I said yes, we don't know, and value for money, we do need more of it.
Okay, so we can move on then.
I have a few other remarks which I've prepared to share with you, which are about the future of aid, because I think aid is very much an institution and a set of procedures which are unreformed and stuck in the past, particularly compared to most other areas of government expenditure. And I want to put a few things out there that we can discuss. So, first of all, we don't look at aid in the context of other resources. So there are many things going on, even in very poor countries, in terms of direct investment, domestic resources, remittances, flows coming out of the country as well as flows going into the country. We act as though all of these resources can be mixed up in a pot and used for the same things. But actually, aid has particular comparative advantages and should be used for those particular things. So we don't use it for what it's best for. We also assume that aid is about the money that comes from the 23 countries that are members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. That's where all our statistics come from. But if you go to a country like Lebanon or Palestine or Bangladesh, then you'll find very large amounts of aid coming from Gulf countries. Most of that aid going direct to the government or for particular large projects. If you don't take that into account, again, you're getting a completely distorted picture of the world's aid, let alone China. And the other resource, particularly in the context of relief that we don't take account of, is what people do themselves. Actually, not only in the context of relief, because we know that very poor people rely on other poor people mostly for their well-being. But the main thing that the Tsunami evaluation found was that if you want to save lives, it's local people who save lives. It's not the big international response. And yet all of our humanitarian response is predicated on this idea of going out there and delivering relief. So that's one thing that we need to take into account. The second force that I think might shape I hope, will shape the future of aid, is the focus on people who are left out of progress, people who are in chronic and extreme poverty, the bottom billion, not just in countries that are overwhelmingly poor, but in many countries that are very well off. India is not very well off as a country, but it holds something like a third of the world's malnourished children. It's not receiving very much aid from countries other than Britain at the moment. And the idea that poverty is going to be concentrated only in poor countries as the world progresses seems unlikely to me. It seems more likely that we will have excluded and very poor and intergenerationally poor people in many countries of the world. And I'm not sure aid is very well adapted to fit that. I think it also challenges one of the conventional wisdoms, which is that government ownership is the way that one should go in delivering good aid, because many governments actually are not interested in the very poorest people in their communities and their societies. Aid is the one resource we have which can be ruthlessly targeted on poverty. Is it therefore a good thing to think that aid should always flow through governments? The third force is, I think there is an increasing, and this may reflect my own particular view, but I think there is an increasing impatience with the lack of decent data. In a world where you can check your bank account and make a transfer online in almost anywhere, and where you can look at where you're going on holiday on Google Earth, you can't actually find decent, up-to-date, real-time information about aid. We're all gearing up in DI to do our usual work around the aid stats, which come out in December. Those aid stats, which we will analyse probably by January 2011, will be the data for 2009. It's a disgrace that we don't have more up-to-date data. The third thing, the force that may drive change, is transparency itself. People have been talking about the same things in aid for decades. They've been talking about technical cooperation and how what we ought to do about technical cooperation has been agreed, I think, since a book in 1975 by UNDP. There's hardly anything that's changed about what ought to happen on TC. But because the political economy is the same, i.e., consultants and researchers driving the agenda and wanting to maintain, I'm caricaturing, wanting to maintain their interests, because that's not exposed by knowing where the money actually goes, there's a real problem, and we don't make the changes. Fifth one, in health here in Britain, ask the patient is a standard measure or means for delivering quality in health. We have no such thing in aid. We ask the bureaucrat. We do not ask the patient. There is no feedback coming from the people who are apparently using or benefiting from aid back up into the system. So we don't even know what's been delivered. So moving on just quickly, if I may. Am I all right, Paddy?
You're all right. You
minutes?
are going to talk about corruption, are you, at some point? You weren't.
No, I wasn't going to talk about corruption probably in the sense that you meant, because I am planning to talk about the things that donors can do something about. And the primary thing donors can do something about in terms of corruption is publishing their own data. What we have at the moment is a set of descriptions. So when you receive your information about how much aid is spent on health in Uganda, that's because somebody has said, oh, I think this project looks like health. They could equally have well said it looks like gender or it looks like a road. Quite honestly, it's not dishonest, but you could interpret that in different ways. And it could equally well have gone to ODI for research on health, or to us, or it could have gone to the Ministry of Health, or it could have gone to an NGO. We have a set of descriptions. What we don't have is the transactions. We don't know where the money has gone. We don't even know where it is, actually, in the aid system. So how can you demand accountability and address corruption if you don't know where the first check is cut to in the system, which is one of the things that IATI is planning to deliver.
Okay, your last word here.
My
Julie.
last word here is that, oh dear.
What, you had two?
I have half a page. Information, information is power. The key thing is to get the information on real facts, transactions, literally where the money is spent, geocoding, and traceability, being able to track the money through the system into the hands of people who are able to use it directly if you want to achieve accountability.
Thanks, Judith. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm sure you'll be able to cleverly feed your other material into answers from the audience.
I'll try.
Okay, Giles, what do you think?
Okay.
You've got a crib sheet.
I've got a crib sheet. I started off, like probably a lot of people in the aid industry, as an idealistic young aid worker, frighteningly nearly 15 years ago, and I think I saw myself sort of driving into the village on a Land Rover with Red Earth and solving problems and then singing songs under the sunset around a campfire, playing the guitar brilliantly. And that's part of the problem with the aid industry, actually, is that it is full of idealism and ultimately ideas which are a bit patronising. And now we find ourselves on a very cold night in London talking about the same issues that I thought I wanted to solve 15 years ago. Aid is depressingly ineffective. Trust your gut judgment. If people are very poor, can they be helped with some money? Yes, absolutely. It is quite complicated on how to do it, but it is absolutely possible. The way it's delivered, however, is deeply shocking, and I don't think we're going to go in. We're having one of those expose sessions here. We all talk about terrible projects that we've seen. But if you want an example, I used to run the British aid programme in Rwanda. Well, you know, I had a French counterpart and his team and his Rwandan team, and a Belgian and a Canadian and an American and a Swiss. And this whole way of delivering aid through our national own ministries is very corrupt in its way, you think, because if it's about reducing poverty, why do we need our own ministries and our own people duplicating the same roles to go and deliver this stuff? Why aren't we just saying, right, who's got the best track record in reducing poverty, and so we'll give our money to them? The aid industry is frighteningly ineffective. There are various useful studies that have been done on the very limited data that does exist, and they all seem to come up around, the ones I've seen, that, you know, really in terms of how effective aid should be, you're getting about 30% of effectiveness for most British aid. So out of every pound, about 30p reaches where it should do. The UK does a bit better than most other countries, but we're part of a global system. We have to think of it as a global system of aid. And I want to give you really one fundamental idea about why aid is so ineffective. And it's to think of it as a public service. Now, the private sector generally tends to be quite efficient in the way it uses resources because it has the profit bottom line. It has competition to keep it effective. The public sector always suffers with efficiency, but what keeps it reasonably effective is the accountability mechanisms that are built in. So the fact is, those of us who pay for it also get to see the quality of it. The politicians who oversee it need to make sure it's not too bad, otherwise they'll get voted out. We have a 24/7 media, but also we send our own children to the schools that we pay for. Our families go to the hospitals that we pay for. We see the quality of the roads that we drive on. Aid is fundamentally unlike any other public service in that we pay for it. We have no idea what happens to it. And more importantly still, the people who are supposed to benefit from it have no levers at all with which to influence its effectiveness. Absolutely no feedback mechanism whatsoever. So what you have is all the worst potential of public sector inefficiency and none of the saving graces. And it leaves you with essentially a deeply compromised system, which is terribly depressing because aid absolutely can work, and I've seen it. And I don't want to go on at length now, Paddy, about your question about corruption, but corruption is overall, to really simplify, it's a bit of a red herring in the aid industry. It's just not as big a problem as a lot of the critics say. And it's nothing like, essentially, the moral corruption of the way in which we deliver aid, particularly as a bunch of Western countries. And I think that when we look back in history, and I work for a big Western government in delivering aid, that the whole model we've talked about, particularly in very poor countries like Africa, where we've sent in, whether it's charities or aid donors, sending in people who, you know, have absolutely great intentions but don't know anything about the environment which are going in, are given responsibility for lots of money, are not told to actually talk to the people that they deliver it to, are not held to account, have no expertise in monitoring and evaluating what this aid is. We'll look at it and we'll go, in the poorest countries, you know, we didn't actually move from colonialism to independence when it came to this kind of engagement. We sort of moved in this halfway house into this very patronising system, and hopefully we can now start to move beyond that. It comes most effectively from countries actually becoming powerful enough, recipient countries, to actually choose. Very interesting, you see countries who'll do that. Rwanda, after the genocide, about a year after, chucked out half the 200 NGOs because the duplication was absurd. India, when it got, you know, started to get really wealthy 10 years ago, said, right, if you don't give us more than $50 million a year, you're out. They cut their number of donors to 6. And that power mostly comes from those countries that are able to do it. The problem is the poorest countries tend not to push back. So we still have a very, very corrupt system.
Right. Vicki, I'll follow that. I mean, Giles has been talking essentially about countries. I'll maybe flag up to Jonathan. Could you say, when we come to you, maybe talk about the Paris Agreement and whether some of the reforms in that might deal with some of Giles's problem? But from an NGO point of view, are you depressingly ineffective? Sorry, not depressing. But are you depressingly ineffective? And are you patronising, I suppose, is another, from an NGO point of view? I mean, this is the accusation against national aid, but does it apply to you lot?
I sincerely hope not. I mean, if I can explain the perspective that I'm coming from, we are a small foundation that supports local organisations working on the ground in Africa and Asia, in fact. And we do so by providing a kind of funding that is little often found in the sector, which is unrestricted funding. And I think that speaks to a lot of what has already been said around putting the decision-making and the power to use funding effectively in the hands of the people who know how to use it most appropriately. I think, you know, the discussion around accountability and transparency is very important. And while I can't speak with a great amount of expertise about funding that goes to governments, I do know, and here, hopefully, to show how unpatronising we are, I actually have one of our recipient organisations directors here, Irene Nyamu from Childline Kenya, who I hope we'll hear from at some point over
Yes,
the
I'll
evening.
make sure, Irene, we pull you in. Yeah.
But, you know, we were speaking just before we came up here, and you know, in Kenya, a country that's often come under fire for levels of corruption in government, but which has recently had their new constitution, and this is being seen as a very positive thing locally. When you've got strong civil society organisations in those countries, when you've got a legal framework that spells out what the responsibilities of those governments are, when you put funding and the power and the strength to operate in the hands of local organisations, you give them the room to be able to make sure that those governments use that funding effectively. So I'm sure Irene can speak to us about how Childline works very closely with the government, so they are operating with them, but they're also pushing back and making sure that government is delivering on the things that they've promised. So yes, in that respect, transparency is very important around what funding is there. Likewise, when you're giving funding, obviously it's important that you're accountable for that and making sure that it ends up in the right hands. So we run, for example, quite a laborious and difficult process for identifying the organisations that we will fund, and they do have to demonstrate their track record, their capacity to use funding to have a positive outcome on the beneficiaries that they work with. They also have to demonstrate their strength as an organisation to show that they can use funding effectively. But I think on the flip side of that, then when you've assessed an organisation's ability to use funding sensibly, you've got to stand back and give them the freedom to do that. And I think when we're talking about accountability and the value and effectiveness of aid, there is this risk that we over here on our high horses kind of decide what value is and what is important. And actually, locally, you know, you're talking about a completely different set of contexts and bottom lines from which to work from. And often it's those organisations who are working on the ground who best know what is working. You have to give them the freedom to do that. Now, too often, and I think this growing scepticism about the effectiveness of aid could be very detrimental for that. And I mean, one of the reasons why NGOs might not want to talk to publicly about what they will and won't fund, and even institutional funding, is because explaining the importance of having a fully functioning office, explaining the importance of having a staff team and having the funds to pay for that. It's not sexy. It doesn't sound as good as saying we distributed 500,000 mosquito nets to people. Equally important, and you know, it is important that there's funding there to support those things, but you know, I know that we have strived very hard as a small foundation to provide funding that is responsive, because we recognise that it's when it's targeted and when it is, you know, when organisations have the flexibility to use it in the way that best suits them, that it will, in the long term as well, have the most impact. If that means that they need to be able to invest in sustainability funds, if that means they need to be able to invest in generating their own income, then that's very important. And I think Giles raised that too often it's someone else who's deciding what has value and what doesn't. And just, I think, as a closing point, again, going back to that point of cynicism or scepticism, perhaps, that is growing, I think that's important. And I think that it is important that we're aware of the need for transparency and accountability. I also think that we shouldn't let it go so far that we forget that a lot of positive things are happening and that they need to be supported. We need to continue supporting those and not lose sight of the good stuff that is happening and you know, that we do come into contact with, and I know that I come into contact with on a daily basis through our partners.
Well, Vicki, what you're saying fits with Judith's point at the outset, which governments don't have to be the only vehicle, and you're saying NGOs and grassroots organisations. But you, like Judith, haven't mentioned corruption, and I waived it as one of the issues. And I know when I was at Oxfam, and of course they will have changed, this was in the 1980s, but whenever we had corruption cases, it was really quite difficult because on the one hand, you know, I want to publish, but the people involved in fundraising say this is going to hurt us, you know, and there's a media out there which is geared to the negative, you know. Aid goes astray, they want to hear Giles. They don't want to hear somebody saying, well, actually, quite a lot of it is actually, you know, quite useful. So, you know, what's the story? And so NGOs, if I can say, and perhaps I'm going to get lynched afterwards because there are probably NGO people here, but I don't think they've got a wonderful record on fronting up on corruption. What do you say to that? No, not you, Judith. Vicki, because you're the. But what do you think about it? Is corruption? Giles was saying actually it wasn't as big a problem as really the whole patronising, aid-dependent design of the system. But what's your experience?
Well, I mean, we fund organisations, not governments. So I think you know, from our perspective. As I mentioned previously, you know, I think it is important to make sure that you are funding reputable organisations that have a track record, that you can feel confident that they will use funding effectively. But I don't think it's beyond our reach to do that. I think it's important, but you know, it's not beyond our reach to do that. But I would agree with Giles that I think we can't also presume that every organisation or institution working in the developing world is corrupt. I also think that as donors, we have a responsibility to think about the ways that we fund and whether that can actually engender corruption in itself. If I go back to where I was talking about giving the kind of funding that gives organisations the room to move, again, it goes to this bottom line thing, you know, we were saying, there was an article recently that mentioned that, you know, in the business sector, if you have 70% success, you're doing pretty well. You know, why aren't NGOs also given the freedom to test things and make mistakes? Why are we expected to make 100% success out of everything? I mean, obviously, yes, that's important. But if you take away all room for organisations to try out new things, it's suffocating, and you know, you're taking away that room to really develop. So, you know, if we become so limiting and so restrictive, I think it can encourage, you know, there's a risk that an organisation having to fudge its budget lines or make it sound like it's all project-related costs because it's going to be hard to convince a donor to pay for your office chairs. It's ridiculous, you know, and I think there's a degree of actually a wider education around what is important, what needs to be funded.
Thank you, Vicki. Jonathan, the last word to you. Well, we're still good.
Well, thanks very much. Do interject if you want me to talk about corruption. I'm happy to. I'm very happy to talk about corruption. You're right, though. A lot of NGOs immediately clam up when the word is mentioned. Well, firstly, thanks very much for inviting me. Really nice to see so many people here. Sorry I was late. I just want to start by saying I think this is a really, really important moment for development, and I think aid is massively exaggerated as a kind of, the role of aid in development is massively exaggerated. Let me start by saying that. I will talk about aid, but I think in 2010, after the recession, there is a real danger that not the case for aid, which doesn't bother me too much, but the case for development, the case for Britain playing a huge role in helping reduce poverty in the world is seriously at risk. And I think if we even look at Cancun, which is coming up next week, the amount of kind of pressure from civil society around that. I mean, I haven't been here for a few years, I've been in Colombia, but it seems to me that there's not the same kind of passion in the British civil society as there would have been previously. And that is really worrying to me, and that comes down to the issue, a lot of issues, namely the economy, but also the credibility of NGOs, which is something I want to focus on. Accountability, I don't think there's anything more important than accountability in development. Accountability is more than just... accountability means development that's more than just helping people in the short term. It means helping people be powerful, and Judith said that. If you're not wealthy, and if you haven't got much, what accountability systems are sometimes the only thing that you do have. And information and transparency is a vital part, but only a small part, of accountability. So accountability is all I really mind about in the long term. People actually having a say over their own lives. But the question is accountability to whom?
Yeah.
And the debate at the moment about aid effectiveness is deeply worrying, because it's all about accountability to some auditor sat in DFID. That doesn't matter. It does matter, actually.
Yeah.
Let me correct that. It matters for our credibility, which is something that we'll come on to, but it doesn't matter to poor people. Okay, and the whole debate at the moment about aid and accountability is, how do we make sure that value for money? We've demonstrated that 70 cents in this dollar is spent well, right? That's of course partly important. I'm not against auditing. I'm not against. I'm not for lax spending. That is important. But the most important thing is ensuring that this aid has an impact for poor people. And I don't hear people saying that a lot. They're all about, hey, how can we make sure, in the press at least, especially. And I'm afraid it looks like the auditors are taking over DFID. And again, I'm not against checking that money's spent well, but I am against the over-focus of auditing. And if you put too much power in the auditors and you don't balance that by power with the development professionals and have someone in the middle, I heard someone say it really well the other day, have someone in the middle that actually makes the decisions, then you're in serious trouble. The auditors can't be making the decisions because sometimes you have to take risks in development. And if you don't, you end up doing the same things again and again. I think I might have wrote that article you mentioned about and I use this case of this.
Isn't that wonderful? Frontline have brought them together.
But I nicked the statistic from Lawrence Haddad. Yes, and the point is that you have to be able to be encouraged to take risks, and if you make a big mistake, you lose 10 grand. You should be rung up by the boss and say, well done. You tried. And I know that sounds ridiculous, and it wouldn't go down well in the Daily Mail, but in development, you have to try things, and sometimes you make mistakes, just like in any walk of life, actually. Right, I've gone on too long about that point. So the point is, aid effectiveness, yes, absolutely vital, but what kind of aid effectiveness? And I wrote a book called Trouble with Aid, because I wanted to talk about all the impacts of aid. I don't agree that all aid is really ineffective, and I suppose Giles did say that some aid is really good. I've just come back from 3 years in Colombia. I can honestly guarantee that the Christian Aid program in Colombia is absolutely brilliant. And we really need to separate out, and everyone's been saying this, separate out all the different parts of aid. Because some of those NGOs in Colombia or in other parts of the world, all over the world, are absolutely dependent on not just money, but political support from people like us to make a big difference, not just in communities, but in the countries they work in, really challenging the powers that keep people poor. And the danger is, and I'm well aware of the danger, because when I wrote my book, and probably the same happened to Giles, when you write a book criticising aid, all your mates say, you're going to undermine the case for aid. And we have to be really, really careful to, yes, undermine the case for aid when it's bad aid, but to remind people that so much money that is spent, especially by people like Christian Aid, by the way, and I'm sure Stars and other places, is really, really well spent, and we have to keep it up. But what I wanted just to say this, the point I make in my book is we have to analyse all the impacts of aid. So not just how many bed nets we've sent out. I think aid has been worryingly effective. What did you say? Scarily effective.
Depressingly.
That's an even better word. Depressingly effective in a lot of the world. Because big aid, and NGOs have written about it all the time, but somehow we don't join the dots. Big aid has been attached, conditions have been attached to big aid. Big, important economic and policy conditions are attached when the World Bank, the IMF, or donors such as DFID give money to poor countries. They say, you can do this, but only if you privatise X industry, only if you reduce the wages there. And sometimes those conditions are good, but very often they're bad. So when I say, let's look at all the impacts of aid, we should say, what's been the impact of aid on Zambia over the last 20 years? And it's not the direct spend. It's actually the political impacts on the Zambian economy through the conditions attached to aid. Hardly ever looked at. haven't been talked about in the media very much, but it's still going on very much. It has been improved because of pressure from civil society. It's still very much going on. But the most important thing of all is aid dependency. Aid has had really good impacts, even big aid. South Korea used a lot of aid. Botswana used a lot of aid. It ended it quickly. Countries that have received huge amounts of aid, and we're talking up to 30% of GDP or more, and sometimes 100% of government expenditure, for long periods of time, 20 to 30 years, it massively undermines state building. Development is about developing the state. It's not just about responding to health and education problems, which is equally important. But in the long term, governments lose the capability to make their own decisions, and especially lose that vital word, accountability, to their own citizens, because most of the money that they need doesn't come from their citizens. It comes from donors, and donors have political intentions. Britain is one of the very few countries that's really placed poverty at the heart of aid, and it has, and it should be congratulated for it, but most countries don't. They have political desires for their aid, and that's why making aid accountable to politicians in our countries and even to voters, and that idea of kind of asking voters to vote on the best aid scheme or something like that is a terrible idea. But I know what they're coming from. They're talking about development education, which is vital, but as I understand it, and people will be from DFID here, they've just cut the development education budget in DFID. It's not something they're planning to do very much anymore, which is a disaster. Right, so let me just finish by saying this. We need to massively re-energise the hope in development, belief that, yes, countries like Britain can make a big difference. It is depressingly complex, I'll give you that, because we have our own commercial interests, but we also have moral interests, and we do care. But we need to somehow get that right, and it depends on the credibility of the NGOs that really are credible, and most people trust the things that NGOs say. But when it comes to aid, unfortunately, our position has been not particularly strong, in my view.
One last minute.
Yeah, all right. On corruption,
Good.
just because I know you want to talk about
Make a Northern
corruption.
Irishman happy.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. It's a bit of a red herring. There is not any evidence to suggest that aid leads to more corruption broadly in countries. In Mozambique, it probably did lead to more corruption in a country that wasn't very corrupt when it came out of the war, interestingly. In other countries, it may well have led to less corruption because of the pressure that donors can place, and sometimes they get in and really help finance ministries to sort out corruption. I don't think there's any evidence that aid increases corruption. What is clear is that there is loads of corruption. The big problem that NGOs have had, I think, is that we haven't been prepared to say corruption is the most important thing in many countries in the world. It's absolutely the most important thing for poor people to be able, and it's all to do with accountability. They need power to make decisions over their lives, and that's undermined by corruption. But the link between aid and corruption is exaggerated. I was watching Enron the other day. That's one of the most corrupt, biggest examples of corruption you can imagine. Corruption is throughout the West, as well as the poor world, although it is bigger in many countries in the poor world. But the point is not aid, but the NGOs have to start saying, yes, because that's exactly what our partners say. Whenever you speak to the partners we work with, corruption is a massive issue, and we have to support them to fight against it. But we need to find a credible voice about it, so that we can say the truth, and have a longer. I don't know. We make short-term decisions because of the media. We don't say things because we worry what the media is going to say. But in the long term, we undermine our credibility by doing that.
Okay, well, thank you. And that last point about bashing the media, there will be another seminar here where those of you who want to bash the media can have a field day. But we'll stick on aid and accountability at the moment. Now, for your panel, I'm very relieved. We've had some agreement, there's some overlap, but we've had a whole range of points that which you can't possibly all agree with, I'm hoping. I mean, I'd just pick out some of the things that rang from me. One from Judith, which is we really need to think hard about, is that a very large percentage of the very poorest people are not in the poorest countries. They're actually in the middle income countries, the BRICS, Brazil, India and China. And I mean, I was really staggered to see that the percentage of malnourished children in India 10 years ago was 43%, and the latest statistic I could see, it was 42%. Despite the economic miracle of India, child malnutrition has hardly moved. And from Giles, I have this absolutely clear point that there is no, in his experience, real accountability to the aid beneficiaries. There's just no feedback mechanism, and that was his experience. And from Vicki, we heard part of the possible solution, which is unrestricted funding and power being given to local groups. I hear her case for NGOs owning up on administration costs. I was a trustee of Comic Relief for 10 years, and I confess I went along with this. We don't spend a penny on admin, which was strictly true from one point of view. They got lots of things donated, and they were brilliant at doing that. I think they still may be. But I think that undermines other NGOs who actually, you know, what is the case for saying we don't have admin costs because we really don't have admin. We don't know what the hell we're doing. We can't answer your question. I'm sorry, there's nobody here anyway. You know, so I'll put my own hands up here. I went along with it. I thought it was a brilliant selling point at the time. But then from Jonathan, a whole number of points that you know, picking up and accountability, but to whom? And then he mentioned a word which nobody else, which is state building. When did you hear about state building as part of the development process? So we've got the NGO discourse, but we've also got the state building discourse. And then your thoughts on corruption. I was delighted you spoke on corruption. I was hoping somebody would. Okay, now this is, the panel's had their initial say. This is your chance. Nina, where's Nina? Nina's got a mic. Could you put your hand up and just wait for the mic if you've got a question? Who's got the first question? There's one here. That's great.
I'm just here beside.
Oh, you're stealing it. Okay. Oh, that's fair enough. Okay, I'll make sure they come to you. Could you just give your name, and if you can, could you say, you know, you're from an aid organization, if you're not representing the organization, but just, or you're a hack, or whatever the hell you are.
I'm Jean-Yves Clemenceau. I am today studying at the LSE, but I'm a journalist and former aid worker. I worked for the International Red Cross. I'm interested to know whether you consider that the use of new media, I mean internet, mobile phones, or maybe some special web platform like OPHI, can have an impact on accountability or on feedback from the victims.
Okay, well, does anybody have a view on this one? Judith.
Sorry, you
No, that's all good.
Okay. Yes, and I think a lot of people are, for instance, if you look at India and the Right to Information Act, you've got people at village level, at panchayat level, using the internet to see who individually is entitled to the employment guarantee money, which in terms of corruption is a major way of addressing corruption, because you can actually see who is entitled to particular things. The overcoming the problem that Giles talked about so well on the absence of feedback from people affected, new media has a big role to play there and is already doing it. It's not like it's something that people are saying, oh, we should go out and do this for them. Actually, people are using their mobile phones now to achieve those sorts of changes, and I would say that the development community is somewhat behind the curve in addressing what people are already using in terms of their technologies. So I think it is important.
Does anybody want to reinforce that or disagree? No? Okay, Nina.
Sorry, I just...
yes. Nina, could you come to Irene, who has already been identified as a partner of Star Foundation. Irene, could you just say who you are and where you're from?
Thank you, Paddy. My name is Irene Nyamu from Kenya. I work with an NGO, Coulter, in Kenya. I just wanted to respond on the issue of the new technology. And what's the most amazing thing is the penetration of mobile into Kenya, for example. And what we have seen is that the government is now using or rather people can use the mobile technology to get services. For example, it was very difficult to apply and get a passport. That's a very easy thing, I suppose, in most Western countries, but a passport is a very important document. And these days in Kenya, you can actually apply and keep track of it. You can use the SMS to ask where is the process at. You can track quite a number of possible services through that means. So mobile technology is making a huge difference in the way services are delivered in many countries in Africa, and is also becoming a very important tool for banking. The huge percentage of maybe 60-70% of unbanked people are now using their mobile to actually make financial transactions, pay bills and things like those. And it's not restricted to the urban area. You can actually do it even in the rural area because the penetration has been very, very good.
I think that's a very important point, that it's not, new media isn't just the internet, it's particularly in poor societies, the mobile phone. And I'll just make a plea, don't forget the old media. There is that World Bank study which shows that when the Ugandan government released the allocations, was it in education, Judith?
It was in education.
And fed that information out through the newspapers, very old media, that had an amazing effect. I think, at the district level, allocations which had previously been at 20% for, say, primary schools, went up to 80%. There is a study somewhere on that.
There's a new randomised control trial on that, which has been reported, which has fantastic results in health. So do look for that.
So thanks for that question. That's a good one. But this gentleman here has been patiently waiting in... My God, all hell's breaking loose outside.
Should I wait?
No, no, you're amplified, so we can hear you.
Good evening. My name is Ishik. I'm from the LSE.
God, is everybody here from the LSE?
It's just a coincidence. I'm a student in the Department of International Development, and prior to this I was working with the United Nations in Baghdad. I took issue with actually a lot of the things that were said regarding aid, but I think the one that jumped out at me the most was this issue that Britain spends the most on decreasing poverty, and I think I took the most issue with that because I'm worried that people might believe it. And I say this because DFID's budget has increased this past year, and it's one of the few government departments' budgets that has. And DFID's priorities for the coming years are going to be extremely war-torn countries: Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq. These countries are the countries that have proven time and time again that they are not accountable with their aid. However, the amount of aid being pumped into these countries is increasing. So effectively we have a system where good performing countries, the Ghanas, the Bolivias, the Tanzanias of the world, are not being applauded for their institutionalization of democratic accountability. And the Somalis of the world are effectively being congratulated and given more aid. And this is bad on its own, but it's actually bad for a second reason, which I think will hit closer to home. The people in these countries, and having worked in Iraq, I can tell you beyond the shadow of a doubt, the Iraqi people are not dim people. Despite the British pullout, they know that even when the British pulled out of Basra, that pullout was replaced by an equal, if not greater, increase in the amount of British consulate staff in the southern Iraqi city of Basra. And why are they there? They're there because of the new superhighways that are being built between the Basra oil fields and the Persian Gulf. The Iraqi people see this. They know that the aid being pumped into their country is benefiting a few conglomerates in the world. They realize this, and this in turn is actually decreasing the security of British citizens at home. So how is it that we can sit here and say we should be pumping more aid to make ourselves safe, and effectively securitizing aid, which is morally incomprehensible, and then claim that aid is actually helping us? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we really need a DFID spokesperson to deal with those points, and I don't think any of our panel is such a thing. But I think you've got some background on Iraq. Yes, Giles.
I do have a little bit on Iraq. Although I mean, I'd start off by saying I suspect, not being very close, I suspect there's a bit more politics going on than a really significant reallocation towards those countries. There will be an increase in those countries, but I think how much that's been stressed by the new administration reflects the fact that they feel very insecure about the constituency of support, particularly within their own party, of the aid budget. And therefore they've highlighted this link with security, which plays quite well to Conservative Party instincts. They want to hear, oh, so it's not just about doing that, it's also about national self-interest. And I think you'll find that still a lot of the core of the aid budget is still going to traditional developing countries. I think what your comment, though, does absolutely pull out for me is something else that we tend to miss, is, you know, the targeting of aid budgets overall absolutely gets compromised by all sorts of other interests. At the moment, for the UK, it's this perception of security interests, also commercial interests. I think for America, you know, out of their top 10 aid recipients in the last 10 years, only one of them is African. You know, Israel's the biggest recipient of US assistance, then there's Egypt, there's been Pakistan, Iraq, you know, where most of the money does not reach Iraqis by any stretch of the imagination. For Europe, there's been a preference for a long time for North African countries, which are certainly not the poorest. And it comes back to this issue for me, which is that, you know, we're not standing back and saying, right, who's got the best record of reducing poverty, who's proving it, who's measuring it, and therefore, on the basis of that competitive process, we're going to give it to the winners. We're going to introduce the incentives in the system by targeting on money on proven success that therefore changes the system radically and sees aid actually reach value for money. And it would answer, interestingly, the country targeting question. Because if you're giving it towards agencies who have a proven track record and they say, I can achieve more in helping people in Tanzania than I can do in Iraq, that would naturally bias the system towards it. So, you know, it plays into that wider question for me.
Thanks. So any of the others? John?
Well, you know, because it was a massive disagreement with what I said, let me at least answer. I actually agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, you have to use shorthand when you're doing these kind of things. DFID is one of the few organisations since 1997, aid organisations, that I think it's law now in Britain that aid has to be poverty related. And that is changing under the Tories, absolutely. Although Giles might be right, not as much as they might say. But my point was that in itself is exceptional for aid more generally. In other words, people in Britain think that we have this conception that aid, it's kind of almost agreeing with what you're saying, we have a conception that aid is poverty related because we do actually, or certainly in the past 13 years, have made more of an effort than most countries to really relate it to poverty. But that misconception does not exist in most other countries. The US is absolutely explicit that aid is part of its foreign policy agenda. They won't even deny it. It's just, it always has been. Britain was like that until Labour came in and actually made this massive focus on poverty. Whether they succeeded or not, I don't know. And it's going to change possibly now. But you know, I wanted to make the point that we shouldn't be under any illusions that, and this is the issue of whether aid's been effective or not. Aid has been effective because it's not actually only meant to reduce poverty. That's why I talked about conditionality. Aid has been meant by rich countries to make far different changes than reduce poverty. It's one of the most hilarious things in the last few years has been the rise of the other donors. China, even India's got a program, Latin America, and immediately you know, we say, oh, what are they up to? You know, they're spending money in Africa. What can they be doing? You know, of course, they're self-interested. Of course they are. China's got loads of poor people. Why isn't it spending it on itself? Because aid is part of a package. It's part of a business package. What's hilarious is that we don't think that we're up to anything. All of our aid is just generous. When the Chinese turn up, well, they're really up to something.
Is there a very shy and retiring DFID person in the room who would like to speak up passionately in defence against this slur from the LSE? We did ask, or rather Millicent did ask for, we wanted a DFID hat on the platform, anticipating there would be flack. But anyway, is there another question not from the LSE? Is anybody here not from... oh, great. Are you from the LSE?
My name is Richard Brown. I'm loosely associated with something called the PRDU in York. But I just wanted PRDU, Post-War Reconstruction Development Unit in York.
In York, great.
The University of York. I just want to pick up on the DFID point. I'm not from DFID at all, but I think what they would say now is that what they're looking towards is, in the link with securitisation of aid, is preventing conflicts. So now the focus will be not just on Iraq, Afghanistan, those sort of places, but more the places like Yemen, etc., which potentially are going to go into conflict, and trying to look at aid as supporting the effort to prevent that decline into conflict. So as a pre-conflict inhibitor, if you like. I think that's what they would say now. That's been the real
That's a fascinating question, though, because, I mean, probably if you ask your average Yemeni, they would say, British government funding helping us avoid conflict would, I think, probably create extreme mirth. And it does reflect back to me a bit that I think as aid agencies, there is the tendency to try and take on, oh, we have the answer, we can be part of the answer, and mostly it's not. It's about being able to back successful local ideas and look for evidence. I question whether British aid money will have a significant influence on conflict in complex countries.
Right. I'd like to speak up for Yemen. I spent 2 years working for Oxfam in Yemen, and I think they're very ingenious, clever people. They're the Irish of the Arab world, very hardworking and underrated. Nina, right at the back, over in the far corner. They get a bad press. It's right near the door. Have you got it?
Hi, I'm Lorna Sals. I'm a journalist. I'm from Denmark. I'd just like to hear when you operate in countries where there is a lot of corruption, for instance, Afghanistan, where is admittedly a part of the economy. How does that work with sort of accountability? Because you can't operate in Afghanistan, I imagine, without admitting to some kind of corruption. You have to sort of get building permits. You have to get permits to get anything going, and you need to give money to people that you wouldn't give money to otherwise. And how does that work if you have to sort of give full disclosure of where the money is going?
Yeah. Now, how about that, Judith?
We tend to talk about corruption as a digital issue. You're corrupt or you're not corrupt. But if you look at consultancy fees in the aid system over the last 10 years, you would find they had gone up massively, particularly in the financial sector or sectors where aid is, people have been wanting to spend more money. And everybody in this room earns more in a day than a Burundian earns in a year. So the issues around corruption are not digital, in my view. They are quite different. I also think that in the context of aid, taking my colleague's points, donors spend a hell of a lot of time trying to do things that actually you cannot do as an outsider. You can't create peace, you can't create good governance, you can't do most of those things, and we waste a huge amount of our intellectual effort thinking that we can. But we don't do the things that we could do that would limit corruption. So, for instance, we do not publish our transactions. You can't find out how much, actually, interestingly, in Afghanistan, the donor assistance database includes cash from Iran. Okay, so it actually tells you how much cash in the form of dollar bills has been received from Iran by the government of Afghanistan. It may not tell you all, I suspect, but it tells you some. We don't publish any of that data. So how can you possibly start to address corruption when you don't do the things that you could do that would empower people to start the process?
Any other thoughts?
Can I take corruption a bit more generally, and to pick up a couple of points which colleagues said in their presentations? I said that corruption's a bit of a red herring. Now, most of the money we spend on aid does go through governments. It comes through your taxes. It's about 5 times as much as you give to charities. And most successful aid is aid that does try to support and strengthen local institutions. So if you take the education sector in Rwanda, where I was working, the answer wouldn't be about external partners trying to build schools and then someone trying to train teachers, whatever. If you wanted to make a lasting difference in Rwanda on education, you had to develop the education system. And when I was running the program there, the government said, right, we now want to move towards universal primary education. We want to get every child into school. And to do that, we said, well, okay, this is how we think we can help. And we agreed with them a plan on various expertise from all around the world who'd done similar things, to develop the curriculum and to look at teacher training and so on and so forth. But we also gave them a large amount of money. Now, I was one of the people held responsible for that money. And was there corruption involved? Yes, there was some, because you're dealing with enormously weak systems. If those systems were already hugely efficient and accurate with spending their money, they wouldn't need outside support. So there's corruption there. They're extremely weak. Was there corruption? Yes, because, for example, in some schools in Rwanda, we figured out that ghost names were left on the payroll. So salaries would be attributed to that school and then someone would be whipping it off. Now, that is the nature of working within a weak system. The reality, though, was if we got really caught up on that, and that's the kind of, I'm going to broadly stereotype this as the American sort of penny-watching approach to aid, we wouldn't have been able to engage at all. We wouldn't have been able to help them towards where they did get to, which with outside technical assistance and with substantial donor funding was getting every kid to school. So corruption is there. Why is it so big focused in everyone's mind? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, in the past, aid money has been spent horrendously. You know, back in the 70s, particularly when there's Cold War going on, aid money was evidently used to curry favour. So better our bad dictator than someone else's. So, you know, we were giving money in Europe and particularly America to Mobutu, for example, in the Congo, even though we knew he was utterly corrupt. You know, $1 billion at a time, American aid for a few years. Now, that was to do with the politics. The Soviet Union wasn't doing much better, actually. It didn't have the cash. It was giving people weapons to buy their favour. But that is behind us, essentially because we're not sort of geopolitically that much caring about a lot of really poor countries. We don't have this grand corruption. The bigger challenges you face are the rather more complex ones. So in Rwanda, we're giving, the UK, giving the Rwandan government quite a bit of money at the time when the Rwandans were in eastern Congo fighting a war. Now, that's a difficult one because aid is fungible. You give people money to spend on the education system, but you're giving it essentially into a large pot. Some of that pot they're using to fight. And then you're saying, well, how does that work? Am I responsible for that? On balance, the decision that the UK took, and personally I was very comfortable with, which is, you know, Rwanda is going to do what it does, its own view of its national security interests regardless, and either that government is going to make a success of that country, it's not going to relinquish power for a long time, or it's all going to screw up again. And it comes back to the risk point which you were making, Jonathan, which is it's so much better to take a risk. If you try and control everything you spend down to the nth penny, you'll never be able to do anything ambitious. Better to say in Rwanda, well, we're not going to be able to change fundamentals, but by contributing, perhaps we can have a positive impact, perhaps we can make that regime feel a little bit more confident to open up a bit more quickly, and so on and so forth. So aid for me is about these very difficult political decisions. It's not about sort of someone buying Mercedes so much anymore.
And I suppose from our Danish colleague's question about full disclosure, you weren't under the very close scrutiny of the British media and had to justify the position you've just given, because for a certain swathe of journalists, you know, that kind of issue, corruption of the type you described, would be a negative story that they could run and hit you with over the head.
Right, so very quickly, and just to give a little taster of what I hope your next session will be like, let's lay into the media. You know, who does the public in a country like Britain, who do we trust to speak to us about aid? We don't really trust the government because we've had too many worrying stories. So we might trust a couple of people. We might trust the media. Now, the media gives an important account. Well, realistically, the media is a market like everyone else. And if you're the editor of a newspaper, you're not going to send your journalist off to cover a news story about aid, which people don't care about. You might, if you're the stringer out in East Africa, based in Nairobi, say, you might just persuade your editor to take a story on aid if the costs are covered. So if a charity flies you up to their projects in South Sudan, all expenses paid, you'll do the story. Then you feel slightly obliged to talk about the great impact this charity project is having. And you don't get any really great insight. I mean, I'm over-exaggerating, you know, but you don't only get any real insight from the media because there isn't really a listenership for it. And then you think, well, who else will the public trust? Well, it might trust NGOs, and the people has already touched on here. Most NGOs are aid agencies themselves. So even though they know there are these enormous problems with the quality of aid, they're very, very compromised about being able to say it, because they kind of would be saying, oh, a lot of aid is not spent well and it really matters because aid can make an impact, but by the way, give us another 15 quid, you can buy this, you know, this family a goat. And people can't square that circle. So there's no honest, genuinely, there's almost no honest debate out there about this stuff. We don't measure, we don't have we're not asked to measure, and so you do trust that people are making intelligent decisions on the ground, but that's not really good enough.
Yeah. Well, I hope that this is being recorded, and so this will be kept as with no honest debate. I think, though, I don't want questions on that because you must come back next year for this one. I want questions on the earlier bit. Right, how many hands how many people want to ask questions? Let me just see, because we've got, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, maybe we should take 2 or 3 at a time to get through, because we've only got about 20 minutes left, and then so let's, Nina, there's one there. Okay, let's take 2 or 3 and get more people in. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sahar Tagdisi from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva. I wanted to raise two questions about one, corruption, and the second one about the political effectiveness of aid that the gentleman from ODI mentioned. Corruption, I'm slightly surprised, especially since many of us are working in the aid industry here, that the whole shift of the argument, the argument's purpose and focus has shifted from corruption in the in the donors and recipients to corruption in the recipient countries, because like any other transaction, aid, there is a receiver and there is a giver. So if something goes wrong with that aid, with that what has happened in the middle, it could be basically a fault of either of them. And there is this need for focusing on the supply side, i.e. the donors, and to see where the money on that side goes. Recent studies have shown that anything between 40 to 60% of aid goes back to the donors themselves. So that money can be accounted for, and the way that it's been dispersed and so on and so forth.
Okay,
So
your
I
second
think
question?
The second one was to do with the political effectiveness of aid. I was slightly puzzled. I wanted to get some examples of that, because I'm not quite sure to what extent in conflict zones or developing countries in general, the political impacts of conditionalities have been positive. So any examples on that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, and is there someone else? There's another one there, Nina, at the back, and then we'll come forward.
Hi, Robin Wilford. I work in Hackney. I was just wondering if Giles was head of DFID in Rwanda, and he felt that feedback mechanisms were so important, was he not able to put those into practice when he had that position?
Harsh. Well, that one's clearly for you. Unless any of the others have views on. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, these are a little bit focused on Giles, aren't they? I feel a bit bad about this.
Yeah,
he said that people felt they could influence the spend on hospitals and schools. I wonder if anybody, we could have a show of hands who felt they'd been able to influence how much has been spent on hospitals and schools in this country, or their hospitals and schools, or the performance of their hospitals and schools. I guess the point I'm trying to make is quite difficult. And the final point, maybe it's about defining effectiveness, because I think we've heard a few things. One, on accountability, we've had the NGO workers say we just look at the organisations, say that they're okay, and then we wash our hands of it and just give them money, which is a good idea.
Not entirely.
Not entirely, but it's a bit
yeah.
broad-based. And then the Christian Aid programme in Colombia, which must be amazing. I'm just wondering if there's maybe a different way of looking at effectiveness and saying, well, maybe trying to somehow introduce competition between organisations, who does it better than somebody else, as opposed to what are we actually achieving, which is just really complex. And I guess that's try to get away from the fact what are you actually achieving to the kind of more about who's doing better. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm speeding up because we want to get responses and then get more people in. Okay, Jonathan, the question from UNCTAD at the back, can you give any examples? Maybe while you're thinking of that, either Vicki or Judith could talk about answer the first question from it, which was someone who was worried about the way our discussion on corruption was going, that we were focusing more on corruption in developing countries rather than corruption within the system and donors. You weren't, I think.
I don't think I was, actually. I think there is a collusion of interests which serves a lot of what economists would call rent-seeking behaviour, which means that, and I think donors should do what they can do, and we should address corruption in our own systems as a primary goal and see what happens in terms of its effect on corruption in developing countries, not to minimise the impact on corruption in developing countries. Sorry, Vicki, go ahead.
No, not at all. I mean, I suppose not so much to talk about corruption, but I do think what you've spoken to is what I was trying to raise earlier, is that I do think donors should question the way that they fund and the impact that has. And I think that speaks to what you were saying about the effect that aid has had, not the impact that it has had, not being just what are the results that the receiving end has produced as a result of this, but what effect has the way that we have decided to fund had on countries that we're operating in. If we haven't given organisations the flexibility in the room to respond properly, if we haven't given it to the right institutions, I mean, to the other lady from Denmark who was speaking about corruption. It's very difficult to operate in countries where corruption is rife. But if you're not supporting civil society, if you're not supporting the kinds of organisations that can actually make a difference on the ground because they are there, day after day after day, they're not just an agency that has decided that's a country we'd like to work in, thanks very much, for a while because it sounds nice. You know, I mean, then you have to question that. So I think we do have a responsibility to think about who we're funding and how, most certainly.
And Jonathan, on this question of political effectiveness, you were asked for examples. I'd ask you for example single, because something...
What was the question? An example of a positive impact of aid conditionality?
I think you're just being very positive about the impact of...
Oh, I really... See, the thing is, I intend to be entirely negative. And, well, I mean, but there are some positive. I think probably on macroeconomics, the macroeconomy, the overall management of, I think even UNCTAD, which is a brilliant organisation, by the way, has said that one of the few things that conditionality has done is help developing countries actually just not get into so much ridiculous debt or spend too much, those kind of things. But in general, the more micro conditionalities have destroyed, in many countries, the production capacity. And then we all know this stuff, right? But it's not talked about in the context of aid. Well, it is. But then we go away and say, well, let's double aid and halve poverty. But no one says we're doubling aid to halve poverty, and it comes with conditions.
And we must, Giles, let you defend the criticism from Hackney. What on earth could you have done in Rwanda that you did not do? Actually, and also to be don't just be defensive, but I think the second part of it was really about competition between aid agencies and questions about effectiveness.
I'm not going to be really defensive because I can't really defend myself very well. And it was in Rwanda, I think, my experience there doing, working in the most fantastic, interesting country with really a very impressive government and in a lead role with the country's leading bilateral donor, was sort of when I began to realise quite how flawed the system was, including the way that we administered it. There were some things, not to go into too much detail, which we did try and start doing in the UK, both with our own aid and leading other donors, which was about at least trying to get people to make their aid decisions on the basis of evidence of need. Silly that may sound, that really wasn't happening at all initially there, but we didn't get as far as putting in good mechanisms on evidence at all. I mean, your point on people not feeling they have an influence over, NHS funding. I do think, of course, it's always very difficult to say this is what I said and this is the impact it had. But unequivocally, there is this general level of accountability we have in functioning democratic systems where we are quite empowered, articulate individuals. And we do see this link between basic performance and governments getting chucked out when they're not seen as competent to do it. Media putting local authorities, putting building contractors, all sorts of people under scrutiny, then being worried about reputation. And you do have these feedback mechanisms that we fail to have in aid.
Well, that's another discussion. But let's see that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's take them on this side rapidly. Where's Millie? Can I extend the session a little bit more? Okay.
Roger Giorgio, Public. Lots of words. I'll keep a few words, short question, bullet point answer for a charter for improvement. What to do? From all 5 of you, please.
Actually, Roger, you've taken... That was going to be my last thing. Damn it. I'm going to hold that, but I will do it. I promise you. That's brilliant. God, who let the public in?
Hi, my name's Sandra. I've worked in Afghanistan for a while. I just wanted to be devil's advocate for a second and say, is there too much money floating around, actually? We've just had a WikiLeaks of $52 million being taken by one official out of the country, and we know it. And I'm just wondering how far we're distorting local economies, because we really are in places like Afghanistan. And I've been in offering £200,000 for projects and been sent out the room because I didn't have millions. So I'm wondering about that. Also, it's very time-intensive to follow up what happens to even small amounts of money. Are we putting enough effort in? I know people who say, I've transferred the money now, my job's over. Well, it's not. How many of those sorts of people are out there? I'm also, the other thing that worries me is this pressure to spend every year. You know, come April, and it's like, quick, let's spend the rest of the budget, because otherwise we won't get the same amount next year. People start throwing money at things, which I think is causing more harm than good sometimes, because it's not being spent properly, and it's creating this expectation that loads of aid is out there from the international community forever, and it's not the truth. And the final thing is...
Oh gosh, you're lots.
No, but it's all the same thing. It's all about too much money.
Okay.
Well, and the last thing is to Jude. I mean, you were saying that there is a pressure for us to always put money through local governments. And sometimes if you've got a government like Afghanistan that's maybe not functioning very well, and with alleged high levels of corruption, is it the right thing to be putting 70% of our aid through the government channels and not perhaps finding more civil society to spread it through?
Okay, thank you. And then, Nina, Irene again.
I just wanted to make a very quick comment about the political impact of aid. I think there's both the positive and the negative side of it, because in some cases where you find that the donors have withdrawn their aid because they think a country is corrupt, what really happens is that the poor people do not get the services that they need. But on the other hand, what it does do is that it puts pressure on that particular government to put its structures in place. And if I can give an example, for about 20 years in Kenya, there was the need to open up and democratize, the political space. And there was a time when the donor aid was really, really cut out. And what happened is that a lot of institutional aid went into civil society organizations. And those are the structures that actually pushed the government in a very sometimes confrontational way to start responding in terms of really becoming accountable to the citizen. And that has actually changed the situation. So you can use it positively, but again, you have to be careful the extent to which you can push the poor people.
Great, thanks for that. Could you move it then just finally to the...
Yeah, we've been talking about...
Sorry, could you introduce yourself? Just.
Sorry, my name is Lilo. I'm a journalist from Italy. We've been talking about fundings towards foreign countries, but what about inside the borders, like the Migration Impact Funds has been cut for like £5 million, and I don't know, we've been talking a lot of foreign aid, but what about what happens inside the country to those institutions helping migrants here, like this fund?
Right, thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to deal with Roger separately. Sandra's point, first of all, who wants to say there's too much aid money floating around? And then Judith, the point about alternative channels to national governments. Who wants to deal? I think you should. You're the advocate of less is more, or more is less.
Well, I mean, I don't know Afghanistan or situations like that. And that's very. I was going to say conflicty there, a very conflicty situation. And I was talking about long-term development. So in my view, there are a lot of countries that rather than, and it was really a response to Make Poverty History, which is a wonderful campaign, but had, unfortunately, I was on the little group of people that wrote all the policy manifesto, and it was a really good policy manifesto. But all we ended up talking about was let's double aid to half poverty. And what I'm saying is that a lot of countries, especially in Africa, need to set out a medium-term plan to reduce aid over time, because there's too much aid for too long in a lot of countries. It's not sudden, because a lot of people, as someone said, rely on aid for their jobs, for their services. Absolutely, but it's not a question of in 2010 saying let's double aid. Maybe we'll reach that by 2015, and then we'll keep that going for another 10 years, and then maybe we'll start reducing it in 2030. It's about starting now to look for an exit strategy from aid.
And Judith, the point about alternative channels to national governments, I don't think, we had the example here of NGOs as an alternative channel. Budget support doesn't have to be at a national level, it could be at a local level, it could be NGOs, it could be other actors, could it?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, actually not much aid is spent through governments. Everybody hugely exaggerates the amount that is. In Britain we do more than most, but overall it's an extremely small amount of aid that goes in basket funding to governments. But we have this mantra that it should, that if we spent it through governments that would be the right thing. I think if you look to the future of aid, that's simply not where aid should be. I take great issue with Jonathan saying the objective is to make aid redundant per se. Yes, in individual countries it would be a good thing if they were not dependent on aid. But can we really think it would be a good thing if we didn't have an international institutional architecture which underwrote basic social provision globally? I think we should be working to convert aid to that, and that will mean not spending so much through governments or thinking that's how it's going to deliver. Can I pick up the migration point?
Yes, do.
We already use aid money to support migrants in our own countries. You can support migrants for the first year of their living in donor countries from the aid budget, and globally we spend between $4 and $5 billion doing that through our own systems. We subsidise our own immigration support.
Now, who wants to pick up Irene's point? I think that you raised this dilemma that about how if you clamp down on, say, corruption. Kenya had earlier this year had this problem with education spend, and the British government suspended aid, which they rarely do for the reasons you've described. But you know, here is the poor suffering. People do not go to school. On the other hand, Irene is saying, but it does put pressure on governments to sharpen up their act and be more accountable to their own citizen. Where do you stand? Where do you stand on this?
You've been there.
Kenya is a great example of a country who's had a very difficult set of debates for decades on political conditionality. What's the answer? Well, what doesn't work at the moment is the turning off of the tap, and it's kind of like you get lots or you get none. And if I'm the Kenyan government, or indeed Kenyan civil society organisation, I don't get one message from the outside world. What I get is America saying, well, you need to do this a bit differently. The UK saying, well, this is the real trigger that's going to decide what we're up to. And Germany and the European Union, the World Bank, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is just very silly. So you don't have any impact with that. And what I think you need is a system which doesn't change things overnight, because it can really affect poor people who are very vulnerable if they suddenly have the funding going. But you have, you know, agreements on very clearly from the combined set of international actors who are providing money, saying these are the triggers on which we're going to do it. This will, you know, mean that we have to reduce by 10%, 10%, 10%, and so you create stability in aid flows, which allows for good planning, and you provide for consistency in messages, so governments and civil society actors and others know what they're dealing with.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Well, this will have to be the last group of questions, otherwise Millicent will cut us off. Kate, there's one here. Any others? Oh, great, the last question.
My name's Beth. I'm another student from the LSE. Giles mentioned earlier working with a school on developing the school, basically, in training teachers and administrators and making sure the school functions. But as I'm sure you know, educating children also involves nourishing them and vaccinating them and making sure they have a safe way to get to school. And all of these might be the domains of different organizations. So what I would like to know is what type of tools and practices do you have for communicating how to get a project done when it requires so many different areas of expertise, and how would you like to see those tools and practices improved?
Okay, who wants to have a go at that? I mean, I think we must let you, Giles, because I think what you were saying is Rwanda has, in terms of quantity, in terms of figures, you know, a massive student enrollment, but to show for its effort. But what about the quality of that education?
Aid tends to be very overambitious in assuming we can change the world. What will happen in the example that you provided only will happen if, in my example in Rwanda, the Rwandan authorities run a competent program. We can support them to bring the necessary bits together. We can help them bring in experts they might not be able to afford who've done it in similar places. But they need to coordinate that effort. And if it just relied on aid agencies talking to each other, totally won't work.
I'll ask another question, just to make you think. How would that question be different if we were talking about France? Look, the question you're asking is how do you do a good education project? It's the same thing in London. It's not, in my view, a development issue. It's actually an organisational issue, and it's the same question. Every country is different. Rwanda will be way different to Colombia, will be way different to India, will be way different to France. So there's not a developed world, developing world thing there. That is just a human thing.
No, but that's a nice point, because what we don't have in the education system in the UK is approximately 30 different people all responsible for something different and no one in control.
Yeah.
Which is
not
broadly
only
what
no
the
one
aid
in
industry
control.
is.
I mean, I know to the woman with the hammer, everything looks like a nail, but we don't know what anybody is doing on education. So if you want to invest in a school in a particular place or a particular sector, how do you go about finding out what other people are doing? You have to go around, donor to donor, agency to agency, ask them. There is no centralised system.
So in that context, when you say it's very ineffective, that example implies that actually aid's making it worse.
I want to clarify this point, because I don't think that all aid is ineffective. I get depressed at how much is ineffective. But intelligent aid is about supporting structures and not being given by a large number of different decision makers. And I'm going to get my one statistic in for the day, because there's lots of people from here from LSE. LSE did a great study a few years ago, and I've moaned about the number of country donors. But the average African country, according to the LSE, has 828 branches of international NGOs. So if the problems of duplication are difficult between country agencies, between international NGOs, they just go ballistic.
Do either of you, Vicki?
No, I mean, I think it's a challenge. It's an issue. It's very difficult. You know, I mean, one of the things that we have been working towards is trying to share kind of the best practice between organisations. It's hard to find the good mechanisms to do that, but I think it's definitely something that should be encouraged. That speaks back to the Hackney interlocutor earlier, is that, I mean, you mentioned why not pick those organisations that are doing a really good job and kind of invest in those, and I think that's what we try to do, and then use that as an example from which others can learn. And I think that's definitely an approach that can bring about benefits, for sure.
I'm now going to put Roger's question to the panel. Look, these people are going to go off into the icy cold night. What is the one, if you had one thing, and I'm sorry, I'm only going to allow you one. These questioners sometimes take 2 or 3, but you're only going to have one point that they go off and think that what to do, what will really be a game changer in your view. And it can be a point that you've already raised and just want to underline it, but it could be something completely new. Judith, I'll go around like this.
It is transparency, but transparency for the user of aid, so that you test everything by putting the user at the centre. What has been delivered? What has been effective? Who is benefiting? What information you need? Instead of starting with the telescope and looking down, you start with the user of aid, and that would be, in my view, transformative.
Thank you. Vicki?
Well, as you might have guessed, I mean, my answer would certainly be to support those local structures, because they, at the end of the day, know best. And let's stop thinking that we know the answers and that, we know best about where aid can be used effectively. Start putting more control locally.
Great. And Jonathan?
To be provocative, more poor people, I think Judith said this, live in India than in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. Add on China, add on Pakistan, add on Indonesia, Brazil. Aid is irrelevant to most poor people in the world. So what I would say is, and to some people it's incredibly important, and it should be less so. To most people it's incredibly irrelevant, and so it doesn't matter. Let's talk about development. Let's talk about what our government can do to actually really reduce inequality and poverty in the world, and aid is a tiny part of that. Let's hold our government to account for the politics that it engages with in foreign policy.
And Giles, the very last word.
Get rid of Western countries and others having their own aid programs, and spend your aid on international agencies on the basis of evidence of success.
Well, that is your panel. I'm not going to attempt to sum up, but I will say one thing, which is I do think we've had a grown-up debate tonight. I'd like to thank you for listening and for putting your questions. I'd like to thank the Frontline Club for actually hosting this in the first place. I'd like to thank Nina for wandering around with the microphone, and Millie, who has been actually the key organizer and who's filming this. Millie is going to send every one of you who've given her email address, she's going to send you an email tomorrow asking for some feedback. Who was the rubbish chair, what you thought of the panelists, and also, I hope she will also give you an idea of when you could pick up the podcast. If you were intrigued about the hammering of the media, which will take place next year, please don't hammer the media. They're sensitive souls, and if you just get at them, they crawl away into... They like handing it out, but they don't like taking it. You'll find that out. You have to woo them. It's Hollywood, darling. So do come for that session. But it would be remiss of me, can I thank the panel in particular, because I think they've served you well and given you food for thought. Thank you very much.